do anything now after Massachusetts, is he?
No, I think he's now realised that he's not going to get cap and trade, the largest tax increase
Absolutely.
in the entire history of the world, not just America.
In a country with trillions and trillions of dollars of debt. But
No
our
way.
government here says it will put the legislation for its carbon pollution reduction scheme before the Parliament for a third time when Parliament resumes next month.
Well, let them try. I think what they'll try to do is to bribe the two Green senators who voted against it last time on the ground that it didn't go far enough, and try to persuade to them, look, this is the best deal you're going to get. If I were Kevin Rudd, that's how I would try to get it through. He may yet, therefore, get it through. What we mustn't do here is be complacent just because Copenhagen failed, just because in the whole Northern Hemisphere we've been under 2 feet of snow. I could hardly get out to catch the plane, come down to Australia. It's lovely to have sunshine here. But there's no doubt that we still face a real threat from people who are instinctive totalitarians. They don't believe in democracy. They don't believe in workers' rights. They don't believe in letting the ordinary little guy keep the money in his pocket. They want to take it from him and, exactly as you say, Alan, to micromanage.
Yes, and we've had none of this explained to us, none of it at all. I mean, he has bought the silence of business by saying, well, we're going to introduce this legislation, but don't worry, we'll compensate you with billions of dollars, and they all shut up.
That's the thing. What's happening here is they're proposing an enormous transfer of wealth from the little guy to the big guy, from the poor to the rich, from the individual to the corporation or to the state. This is a grab for absolute power and absolute wealth. And if you're listening to this and you have a job, particularly a blue-collar job, the kind of jobs that actually keep Australia moving, then be afraid, be very afraid. Kevin Rudd is out to get you.
But there has been an agreement at Copenhagen, when you're talking about transfer of wealth, for nearly $30 billion in short-term financial assistance promised by these developed countries at Copenhagen to be raised and disbursed. Is that still going to go ahead?
I don't think it will, because what is now happening is that people are coming off the Kool-Aid by the thousand. Every opinion poll shows, as you've had one recently in Australia, there's recently one just last week in New Zealand, showing now an absolute majority of the voters not buying into this rubbish at all. Why? After 50,000 times as much money spent on propaganda to promote this as is spent by the other side trying to say, hang on a moment, the emperor has no clothes. 50,000 times imbalance, and yet the opinion polls right through the Western world moving very, very, very heavily against any further credence for this UN climate panel and all of its various supporters.
But your letter to the Prime Minister was so comprehensive and so detailed in argument of January 1 this year.
Yes.
Surely it merited a response.
I would have hoped for a response, but in my long experience of writing letters of this kind, the unanswerable is very seldom answered.
The questions you address to the Prime Minister are, A, very simple, whether there is a climate problem at all, and B, if there is one, is it of the, quote, hilariously overblown magnitude imagined by the IPCC?
Well, of course, there isn't a climate problem at all. We've now had no statistically significant global warming for 15 years. We've had global cooling for 9 years, CO2 accumulating in the atmosphere at less than half the rate foreseen by the IPCC. We have the north and the Arctic ice cap restoring itself rapidly after a temporary shortage of ice in 2007, which did no harm to anything, but now it's restored itself. In the Antarctic, we've had a continuous growth in sea ice for the last 30 years. Polar bears, 5 times as many of them as there were. Whatever is happening to the climate, it certainly isn't doing any harm, and we certainly aren't seeing the global warming of anything like the magnitude predicted by the UN. It isn't happening.
You say to him, in a long career in policy analysis, in and out of government, I've never seen so cost-ineffective a proposed waste of taxpayers' money as the trillions which today's scientifically illiterate governments propose to spend on attempting, with all the plausibility of King Canute, to stop the tide from coming in.
Well, I couldn't have put it better myself. The fact is that that is exactly the point. You see, even if there were a problem, economically speaking, the best thing to do is to adapt as and if necessary. That is several hundred times cheaper than trying to stop emitting CO2.
That's it. So the point that Lord Monckton is making, I'm going to just repeat that, because you're saying even if it did exist, we would be better spending money to adapt rather than mitigate.
Exactly. And that's a very, very important... Every economist except for Lord Stern, who is alone in this, says that you'd be better off
an economist.
adapting. He's not an economist. He's a civil servant.
Civil servant.
Yes. And he was doing the bidding of his political masters, as so many scientists and economists around the world are.
So what's to say for the scientific community?
They, I think, have behaved very badly.
If you don't get your way, cheat.
It's partly that's been going on. I think it's fair to say that the ClimateGate emails that emerged from the University of East Anglia show the widespread corruption of climate science around the world. It isn't just in East Anglia. No. It's the centre of this is actually at the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration in the United States, on which all the terrestrial data sets for temperature are compiled. They produce the basic data, which three organisations, including themselves, then process. And that data has been corrupted. If we take, for instance, the Darwin temperature station, just about the oldest temperature station in Australia. Over the last 100 years, they've tampered with that record so that although they've left the current temperature measurement accurate because the satellites are monitoring as well as the ground station, they can't cheat there. What they've done is they've pushed downwards, for no good reason that I can see, the temperature record going back 100 years, so as to make it look as though there has been 2 Celsius degrees of warming in Darwin when the raw data shows no warming at all over that 100 years.
You also sent to the Prime Minister, did you not, a list of the 114 people whom he took to Copenhagen. You said enough to fill a mid-sized passenger jet. You reminded him of who they were and what their office was.
And weren't they an extraordinary bunch? I mean, climate change ambassadors, his personal photographer. I was surprised to find his personal hairdresser not on the list. I mean, I've never seen the like. And here is somebody who is saying to working people in Australia, in the name of saving the planet, I'm going to confiscate any surplus cash you have. I'm going to put up the price of your electricity 4-fold over the next few years. I'm going to push you out of jobs and onto the dole, but there won't be any dole because we won't be able to afford it because there'll be no industry left in Australia. And all of this while I junk it around with 114 people going all the way across the world from Australia to Copenhagen and back for a really nice junket at your expense. That is kicking the Australian worker in the teeth, and I hate to see it when politicians go on the gravy train and ruthlessly exploit the taxpayer for their own personal pampering.
But then this week, or the week gone, the same Prime Minister said, we're going to have a productivity problem in this country, an increasingly ageing community. Someone's got to pay the health and welfare bill, so we must increase the population from 22 million to 36 million by 2050.
There, I'll tell you exactly what's happening, because the Labour Party in Britain has already done this, and Kevin Rudd, having had discussions with them, is copying them. Most immigrants vote socialist. It's an old rule. It's one of the few invariable rules in politics. And if, therefore, you feel that as a socialist you're no longer attractive to your own electorate, you import socialists by allowing immigration. And that's part of the game that's being played there, I suspect. I may be
and
doing
where does that fit in with carbon emissions?
Well, of course, if you increase your population, you're going to increase your carbon emissions. And that raises a wider point, which I think is worth making here, and that is this. That if you stop people from burning fossil fuels, that's the cheapest and most efficient way to generate electricity, then you make people poorer. There's a direct correlation between the tons of CO2 emitted per head of population in a nation and the wealth of that population, and a direct anti-correlation between the amount of CO2 you emit as a
What damage are we doing to scholarship?
And child mortality, for instance.
What damage are we doing to scholarship by prospering the notion that CO2 is a pollutant?
Well, I mean, that, of course, is completely ridiculous. Every molecule in your body contains carbon. It is essential to all plant and animal life, none of which would exist without it. The very fibres would not be there without it. So the idea that the stuff of life itself, without which there would be no life on this planet, is a pollutant is, of course, bonkers. And carbon dioxide used to be present in the atmosphere here at 20 times today's concentration. If you go back to the Cambrian era, which is 550 million years ago, you and I remember it well. Most people listening don't. But that was how it was then. 20 times as much. And did the oceans acidify? No, they didn't. That was when the calcite corals evolved. Go back 175 million years. Even your producer here will remember that, to the Jurassic era, and at that time there was again 10 to 15 times as much CO2 as there is today. That's when the really delicate aragonite corals came into existence. And just as I was coming to the studio here, the kind friend who brought me here said that she'd just visited Port Douglas, where she'd been out and had a look at the corals there, and she'd said, you know, what is global warming doing to the corals? He said, well, A, there's been no change in temperature in the region of the Great Barrier Reef for the last 30 years in the water. It's just exactly the same as it was. And B, the corals are doing wonderfully. He said the British marine biologist came out in 1928 and recorded and for the first time named the diversity of species of corals here. Every single one of those species is still here and is still doing fine.
It's lovely to talk to you. I must ask you one question very quickly before you go. Am I right in saying that efforts were made to have you address our National Press Club, and those efforts came to nothing?
This is very interesting. Yes, they have a Wednesday lunch, always at the beginning of the new parliamentary session. They normally try to get one of the major parliamentary leaders, the Prime Minister, Leader of the Opposition, whoever. None of those agreed to do it, and they wouldn't have me. They've now got nobody.
Amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Great to talk to you, Lord Monckton. Thank you so much for your time.
And thank you, Alan. Looking forward to you comparing our meeting at 5:30 on Wednesday in the Sheraton on the Park. Be there or be square.
Be there or be square, 7:30.